to History Class with Dr. W and our continuing discussion of 1968. In the previous lecture, I talked about some of the popular books published in 1968, focusing on works of fiction and what I described as creative nonfiction. We'll continue that discussion now, talking about some of the other books published in 1968, focusing on works of nonfiction and biography. One of the best-selling and also most controversial books published in 1968 was the Double Helix, which was published by Dr. James D. Watson. Watson and his collaborator, Crick, had famously unlocked the mysteries of DNA and its structure, the double helix. And so on the one hand, this book is about the science behind that discovery. But it was far more surprising because it opened up and shed light on an entirely new world behind scientific research itself. Watson turns out to be an incredibly creative and engaging writer, and the book is filled with humor and all kinds of surprising stories. But it's also about the ethics of science and research and discussions of who discovered what when and how that whole process occurred. And so the book generated considerable controversy and debate and discussions about whether Watson and Crick really deserved the credit at all for discovering the structure of DNA. One scientist described part of Watson's work this way, as a clawing climb up a slippery slope, impeded by the authority of fools, to be made with caged data, with malice toward most, and charity towards none. And so the world of scientific research, as described by Dr. Watson, is not one of selfless scientists on the quest simply to improve humanity, but rather aggressively ambitious people trying to improve their own careers and make their own reputations. Another popular nonfiction book published in that year was The Strawberry Statement, which was written by James Simon Coonan, who had been a student at Columbia University from 1966 to 68, and he wrote the book primarily about the protest at Columbia University in April 1968, which I described in previous lectures. The title of the book comes from a statement made by Herbert Dean, who was an administrator at Columbia, who described the opinions of students as having no more importance than if the students had said they liked the taste of strawberries. Like several of the other books I've described in these lectures, the Strawberry Statement becomes an important primary source, first-person account of one of the significant events of that year, those protests at Columbia University. One of the most controversial figures of 1968 was Eldridge Cleaver, who published his memoir, Soul on Ice, in 1968. In the book, he described his upbringing in Arkansas, Phoenix, and then in Los Angeles, where he came to be involved first in petty crime and eventually in violent crimes such as rape and attempted murder. He was imprisoned in 1957 and spent many years from then on in prison, which makes up much of the book that he published in 1968. After his release from prison, he joined the Black Panther Party in Oakland in 1966. He was a presidential candidate in 1968 with the Peace and Freedom Party, but that same year, in a confrontation between the Black Panthers and the Oakland police, Cleaver ended up being charged with attempted murder, and he fled to Algeria. All of these episodes are recounted in his book, which joined Malcolm X's autobiography as one of the powerful tomes driving African Americans and the Black Power movement of the mid to late 1960s. Cleaver recounted powerful and troubling instances of his participation in violent crime, such as rape. And At the same time, after undergoing a religious conversion, he revealed many powerful statements about the incarceration system in the United States and racism in general. Just as one brief excerpt, Cleaver had this to say about Malcolm X in his book Soul on Ice. Malcolm X had a special meaning for black convicts. A former prisoner himself, he had risen from the lowest depths to great heights. For this reason, he was a symbol of hope, a model for thousands of black convicts who found themselves trapped in the vicious PPP cycle. Prison, parole, prison. One thing that judges, policemen, and administrators of prisons seem never to have understood, and for which they certainly do not make any allowances, is that Negro convicts, basically, rather than see themselves as criminals and perpetrators of misdeeds, look upon themselves as prisoners of war, the victims of a vicious dog-eat-dog system that is so heinous as to cancel out their own malefactions. In the jungle, there is no right or wrong. Another of the autobiographical accounts published in 1968 was Abbie Hoffman's Revolution for the Hell of It. I already talked in a previous lecture about Abbie Hoffman and his central role in the Yippies and the protests around the Chicago 7 and the Chicago Democratic Convention in 1968. Revolution for the Hell of It is irreverent and anti-establishment and described in hilarious detail many of the protests in the months and years leading up to the Democratic Convention in 1968. The book helped to secure Hoffman's role as one of the key figures in the protests of the late 1960s, and he became ensconced as one of the most memorable figures of that year in our memory. There were several other important and memorable books published in 1968 in the realm of social commentary. Perhaps the most widely debated and discussed was The Population Bomb, which was written by Paul Ehrlich and became a huge best-selling book and a topic of much conversation in 1968 and beyond. Ehrlich discussed the problem of global overpopulation and talked about a population explosion and the fact that in the very near future that hundreds of millions of people would starve to death around the world because there simply wasn't enough agricultural infrastructure and ability to maintain the population which was exploding all over the world. This line of argumentation was not particularly new, and in particular it echoed the arguments of Thomas Malthus, and there's a whole line of argumentation known as a Malthusian catastrophe, where Malthus and many others have argued that eventually population growth is going to supersede the ability of humans to maintain themselves, and that eventually this whole system will crash. But where Ehrlich kind of took this argument to a new level and became very controversial is he was very specific in his predictions, and that he predicted that this so-called population bomb was going to explode in the very near future. And so it actually created not only a bit of a sensation, but real concern in the country that this disaster was pending. As Ehrlich wrote, he said, "The battle to feed all of humanity is over. In the 1970s and 80s, hundreds of millions of people will starve to death, in spite of any crash programs embarked upon now. At this late date, nothing can prevent a substantial increase in the world death rate." The book created a huge sensation and sold millions of copies for Ehrlich, who made a lot of money selling that book. Of course, his predictions turned out to be false, and critics of Ehrlich and the book point out that making these kinds of predictions is a dangerous phenomenon in its own right and can create unwarranted panic around the world, which this book essentially did. As one critic of the book wrote, "As soon as one predicted disaster doesn't occur, the doomsayers skip to another. Why don't they see that in the aggregate, things are getting better? Why do they always think we're at a turning point or at the end of the road? Decades later, even after it was clear that his predictions had not turned out to be true, Ehrlich still refused to fully recant his predictions. This is what he had to say in 2004. When I wrote The Population Bomb in 1968, there were 3.5 billion people. Since then, we've added another 2.8 billion, many more than the total population when I was born in 1932. If that's not a population explosion, what is? My basic claims, and those of the many scientific colleagues who reviewed my work, were that population growth was a major problem. 58 academies of science said the same thing in 1994, as did the world scientist warning to humanity in the same year. More jarring than the population bomb was a work called the Scum Manifesto, published by Valerie Solanas. Scum standing for Society for Cutting Up Men. This was a feminist tome taken to its wildest extreme and discussed the possibilities of simply eliminating all men from human existence. The author, Valerie Solanas, later claimed that she wasn't seriously talking about the killing of all men on Earth, but she was simply trying to spark debate and draw attention to her work, which it certainly did. Much of the work really can't be read in a lecture like this. There's much objectionable language in it, but let me read one brief passage describing the general idea. She wrote, "Life in this society being at best an utter bore, and no aspect of society being at all relevant to women, there remains to civic-minded, responsible, thrill-seeking females only to overthrow the government, eliminate the money system, institute complete automation, and destroy the male sex." Solanas achieved further notoriety in 1968 when, on June 3rd of that year, she attempted to murder the artist Andy Warhol, waiting for him outside of his workplace and then firing 3 shots at him with a handgun. Warhol survived, although he was mentally and emotionally scarred for the rest of his life from that episode, and Solanas was arrested and served 3 years in prison for the attempted murder. A psychiatrist who evaluated her in prison determined that she was a schizophrenic reaction, paranoid type, with marked depression and potential for acting out. Indeed, even after her release from prison, she continued to stalk Andy Warhol through phone calls and other threats, and she was eventually arrested again and served more time in prison. She died in 1988 at the relatively young age of 52. And while she claimed that the Scum Manifesto was never intended to be taken literally, it drew a great deal of attention, and in fact negative attention, to the feminist movement of 1968. There's one more noteworthy book that I want to mention here, coming out of that atmosphere of the late 1960s. It was known as the Whole Earth Catalog, first published in 1968, and then published each year through 1972, when it actually was awarded the National Book Award. The book was written primarily by Stuart Brand, although there were a number of people working on it. And again, this was the brainchild of the kind of free-thinking attitude of the late 1960s. And it was intended in some ways as a guidebook and instruction manual for those many people in the country and indeed around the world who were trying to live a different sort of lifestyle, perhaps a communal lifestyle, environmentally friendly lifestyle in the late 60s and into the 1970s. And so it was intended to offer instructions, pointers, guides, and a sort of shopping catalog as well, pointing people in the right direction of where to purchase different things, how to acquire them, how to work with them, and so on. The introduction to the work wrote, We are as gods, and might as well get good at it. So far, remotely done power and glory, as via government, big business, formal education, church, has succeeded to the point where gross defects obscure actual gains. In response to this dilemma, and to these gains, a realm of intimate personal power is developing. Power of the individual to conduct his own education, find his own inspiration, shape his own environment, and share his adventure with whoever is interested. Tools that aid this process are sought and promoted by the Whole Earth Catalog. It's important to recognize that this catalog was not simply akin to the Sears catalog, a place where people could order things through the mail. It was something different. This was a shift in a way of thinking about humanity and the world and how we do things and how we think about things and acquire things. The founder of Apple Incorporated, Steve Jobs, was very much inspired by the Whole Earth Catalog and compared it essentially to the World Wide Web before the world of personal computers and the internet ever existed. It was a way of thinking broadly about the whole earth and about everything that is out there for humanity to use. So it was revolutionary, again, not just as a catalog listing things and helping people purchase things, but in the way that we envision the entire world and the way humans live in it. In the next lecture, we'll conclude this part of the discussion about popular culture in 1968 by talking about some of the important movies released in that year.